Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. I am just allowing everyone to land, but in the meantime, my name is Hakima. I use she and her pronouns, and I am with the Black Feminist Fund team. I have the pleasure of welcoming you all to this webinar about crisis. The Black Feminist Fund is a global fund that resources Black feminist movements, as the name suggests. This webinar is part of our Black Feminist Politics series, which explores the accumulated knowledge of Black feminist movements. In this global moment, when we see all of the interconnection of systems of oppression, as those become more evident, this series spotlights the creative and transformative power of Black feminist politics and movements. So this webinar is going to be an hour and a half, and we have interpretation in English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Arabic. Naima, could you pop up those instructions for me of how to get to the interpretation? Thank you so much. You will see on the screen that you should choose the interpretation button. It's a globe at the bottom that says interpretation. If you click there, you'll be able to choose the language that you'd like to hear us in. And as a reminder to our speakers and to myself to speak slowly for our interpreters. And all of our speakers will be speaking different languages. So if you're listening in English and you have an assumption that you're just going to be listening to English, it's not true. So I would switch now and choose the channel that you want to hear us all in. So today's conversation is about crisis and Black feminist response. Why are we talking about crisis? Or at least maybe that seems evident in this moment as we're watching every day the genocide committed by Israel on Palestinians in Gaza and the attacks in Lebanon, which we will hear about. But I thought it was interesting in this week, even in the last week, seeing like three events that are related and speak to this state of polycrisis that we're in. And by polycrisis, I mean the ways in which crises are interrelated and compounding, that they're ecological, economic, social, and political crises that we face. Obviously, by the morning of November 6th, it was clear that a man who's been accused of sexual assault and harassment at least 26 times had won the presidential election in the US, not for the first time, but for a second time. And maybe it's better that the face of imperialism be clear, but what we know is that our Black trans siblings in particular are under attack. And those of us in the global South will be facing an emboldened fundamentalist attack that will come for our abortion rights, for sex worker rights, for LGBTIQ rights. And meanwhile, as these leaders kind of congratulate themselves, they'll open the door even wider for our resources to be stolen. The theft of resources in the global South exists not only in unfair trade and odious debt, but looks like deepened proxy wars in the DRC or in Sudan. And in fact, the war in Sudan exists because colonial powers cannot allow for the People's Revolution to bloom. And the second event that I saw this week that really kind of speaks to that, so People's Revolution and how they're not allowed to bloom, was that they've just closed the only international airport in Haiti. Haiti stands as one of the most important struggles in Black liberation, the first rebellion of enslaved people that overturned the colonial state. Haiti is a battleground today because white supremacy has something to prove. It's not a mistake that it was Haitian migrants that Trump attacked during his campaign. It's not a coincidence. Haiti has been the epicenter of a resistance that's African, that's spiritual, that's feminist. And Haiti remains unbowed, despite the imposed crisis on the people, as we will hear from Pascal later. And the third event is that at this very moment, COP29 is happening in Azerbaijan. This is where every year, those that are most responsible for the climate crisis negotiate their way into deepening it. We watch in horror as the scientists try to tell the governments and the corporations about the reality that already exists for so many of us in floods and droughts and hurricanes, and only for the governments to agree to use the same capitalist methods that got us here to get us out of here. We can't trade our way out of ecological disaster. The Black Feminist Fund, with the brilliant Nadia, who you're going to hear from later, we've collated in some ways Black feminist knowledge about crises into a brief that's particularly for funders, to talk about how to fund Black feminist responses and repair. And in that brief, we quote Adrienne Murray Brown, a Black feminist, who says, "Things are not getting worse, they're getting uncovered. We must hold each other tight and continue to pull back the veil." Even though these crises that may manifest in some times as hurricanes or earthquakes or floods, they're man-made. They're made by the systems of domination over land and body. They're made by imperialism, capitalism, ableism, and white supremacy. And because they're man-made, they're not preordained, they're not inescapable, they're not necessary or natural, they're stoppable. And Black feminists are stopping the crisis and creating Black feminist worlds. Now, humanitarian response to crisis claims to be apolitical or ahistorical, almost they claim as a good thing. And they usually come in at inflection points. So the start of a war or the flood, whereas Black feminists live as constant in conditions that are considered crises by the hegemony. And by contrast, Black feminists invite us to understand crises with a historical lens, with a political lens. Black feminists invite us to analyze the conditions and oppressions that cause and nurture and live off of crisis. To reject the normalization of Black suffering, and even to reject this fetishization of Black resilience. Of course we are resilient, but we demand reparation and we demand transformation. Black feminists invite us to interrogate the asymmetry of solidarity, in which some crises are abandoned or forgotten or ignored. And we've built concepts like disaster justice, which was created by Justice Shorter, a disabled Black lesbian feminist. So by listening to Black feminists, we have the opportunity not only to be firefighters, but to address really the root causes of crises. Black feminists know that self-determined community agency will transform our societies and so end the crisis of multiple domination. The solution is us. We used to say when I was younger and organizing, there's no justice, just us. This solution isn't a single one of us, but really the communities of solidarity and mutual aid that we create. The solution is the resistance and the world building. And there's really an urgency, a deep urgency. But I believe we're ready. So this webinar will uplift those Black feminist conceptualizations and analysis in conversation about crisis and response. You're going to hear from some brilliant Black feminist activists from around the world. Not everybody is here, not every crisis is going to be spoken about, but the sense and the idea is for you to hear ways in which Black feminists are conceptualizing outside and how we can build a more effective and sustainable crisis response and repair and prevention infrastructure. So before I pass the mic, I'd like to give a big shout out to Maria Clara. Maria Clara is my colleague, the Movement Partnerships Coordinator, who's the brains and the hands behind this series, and the whole BFF team who are making all the things happen off camera to make this work. to the interpreters, who are our brilliant Black feminist language justice crew, who make it possible for us to have a global conversation. And I want to give a really special thanks to Sarah, who I'm going to pass the mic to, who's working with us as a communications strategist and who's an amazing facilitator. And Sarah will be facilitating this conversation for us. So over to you, Sarah. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Akima. I hope you can hear me. I'm very happy to be here. I'm Sarah Diop, and I'm delighted to facilitate today's session. Seeing someone who is not respecting my afro. So I hope you are all well and feeling well and ready for this conversation that we're going to have this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Let's share this digital space together for 1 hour and a half. And I'm really happy to be able to do this today with you again. As a reminder, we had a first conversation in as part of this series on Black Feminist political series, which was on Europe and what was happening in Europe in a context when we know that 2024 is the biggest electoral year in the history because there are elections across the world which are very important and which has an impact on the Black feminist movements. So you can listen back to it on our YouTube channel in French, English, Spanish, Portuguese, and Arabic. So I just want to use the opportunity of mentioning these languages to emphasize that at Black Feminist Fund, language justice is very important. This is why I'm speaking slowly, and I do invite every speaker today to speak slowly because, like Fatima mentioned, we have exceptional interpreters who are allowing us to hold this space in French, English, Portuguese, Spanish, and Arabic. So if there is any challenge with interpretation, please let us know in the chat. Thank you very much to our interpreters. And I would like to also say that we are in a very complicated period. It's taking a while. It's not easy. Overall, times are difficult. I don't know where you are located in the world, and I do invite you to say it to us in the chat. Where are you joining us from? I'm currently in Brussels, uh, Belgium, but I'm normally based in Lisbon, Portugal. It's a bit cold, which makes my life a bit more complicated. I'm also sharing my love and solidarity with you. And today we are going to speak about a very important subject, which is about crisis. Our lives are not defined by crisis, but it's a good thing that we can have this conversation today. And today's to do so, oh, wow, I'm happy to see the chats in movement. Thank you for continuing to add your questions, your comments. I can see people from all over the world. Welcome to all of you. Wonderful. So, said, I'm going to introduce our four exceptional panelists to you and thank them for taking the time to have this conversation with us to allow us a different perspective because we are from various parts of the world. And we know that when we talk about crises, they are complex and they can be nuanced and complex. So I will call our panelists to say hello when I call their name. Let's start with Francisca Mata, who is joining us from Egna, Liban. Francisca, say hello. Come off your camera and say hello. and specialize in migration and refugees protection and issues that specifically affect Black women in Lebanon. We also have Chandri Dekera, who is part of the coordination of Afro-Colombian women displaced and in resistance in Colombia. Chandri works on social justice issues with a gender approach, anti-racial, uh, anti-racism approach, and politics. Thank you and welcome among us. We have Lucia Dominique Pascal Lalange, who is coming from Haiti, and which is a famous activist who works tirelessly for women and girls' rights in Haiti. Welcome among us, Pascal. And we have Sarah Waya, who represents the feminist movement known in Sudan. Sudanese activists, feminists, and Pan-Africanists fighting against fascism. Thank you very much to our panelists for their presence. I know that this conversation is going to be a very rich one, and we do thank you for your presence. And to start, I will start the first question to set the context for us to know what we're talking about when we talk about crisis. Can you define from your position as a Black feminist, what do we mean by crisis? What are we talking about when we say crisis? And on your perspective, how are Black feminists deepening and broadening the understanding of a crisis moment? Because we know that there could be, we could have an approach that could actually erase the understanding of the crisis. So in your opinion, what do we talk about when we talk about crisis? Starting with Francisco.
Hello. Hi, everyone. That's such a loaded question, but it's an honor to be with all of you here today to share a perspective on this because we really need to rethink what crisis really means. Like the media and in public discourse, they frame crisis like this sudden thing, like war breaks out or there's an economic collapse, and that's when they start talking about the crisis and start paying attention. But from where we stand at the grassroots, that's not at all how crisis works. And let me give an example from where I work in Lebanon and Ethiopia with migrant workers from the global south who travel for domestic work in the Middle East. So, for the Ethiopian individuals being sent to work in places like Saudi Arabia or who are right now being displaced by Israeli attacks in Lebanon, their crisis didn't start when bombs fell on their homes and they were displaced. It started way before that. The crisis began at home in Ethiopia when they witnessed the systematic destruction of their possibilities and of their futures, and especially among the youth. Their crisis started when they faced barriers to accessing education at local schools and in colleges, and when they can't find work because of ethnic discrimination in the job market, or when war and climate change forced them from their homes. And instead of helping them rebuild, the government encourages them to seek job opportunities abroad in countries with a long, disturbing track record of exploiting and abusing foreign workers, while prioritizing economic gain over the dignity and safety of their most vulnerable citizens. And the thing is that all of this is by design. The Ethiopian government is actively pushing hundreds of thousands of women into these situations. And we're seeing this model adopted by more and more African states, sadly, and Ethiopia has already sent about 270,000 women to Saudi Arabia alone. And they've signed similar agreements with 6 Middle Eastern countries, including Lebanon. They're running recruitment drives, making it look like this mass export of women's labor is some kind of development strategy. And they're targeting women who are already struggling, already vulnerable. And it's all functioning on this twisted logic that these women, these individuals are resilient. And this is normalized, unfortunately, because these women see no other path forward. They'll say, so what if we endure domestic violence or homelessness abroad? They've endured the same at home. And because there are no protections for these workers, this entire labor migration policy relies on their resilience alone. And their crisis doesn't even stop there. On the side of receiving countries in the Middle East, migrant workers are governed under the kafala system, which enables and encourages the exploitation of migrant workers and the commodification of Black bodies, especially. And under the system, governments completely wash their hands of responsibility for migrant workers. Like it's practically up to individual employers to treat their workers well. So when abuse happens, and it happens all the time, employers are not held accountable. But when workers flee abuse, they're treated like criminals. Like migrants are goods to be traded with and used. And when discarded, they will figure out how to survive whatever is thrown at them. And now, with the war in Lebanon, we're seeing this play out in the most brutal way. Just last week, we received cases of new arrivals from Ethiopia coming into Lebanon, seeking work in a war zone. They're unfamiliar with the geography, so they don't know where to flee, and they can't speak the language either, so they can't access information about evacuation orders. So you may have already seen images on social media or on the news about how migrants have been abandoned by their employers and denied access to basic services in Lebanon. But like, guess who's expected to respond to the emergency? It's us. It's the migrant community groups. It's the workers themselves and our allies creating networks of support. We're finding ways to survive, exercising what little agency we have to do the work that governments and international organizations with much larger capacities are mandated to do. And then these same actors have the nerve to praise our resilience and rely on us to address emergencies while doing the bare minimum themselves. And all of this responsibility shifting adds to our state of crisis. It's not just in the immediate sense that migrants are left trapped in dangerous, life threatening situations, it also exhausts community resources. It's creating very deep psychological trauma that also passes down through generations. It keeps people in poverty while their governments profit from their remittances, and recruiters, traffickers, and other private actors also profit. So, like, when we talk about crisis, it's not just about specific moments. We're talking about a deliberately maintained situation. These systems are designed to keep us in a constant state of vulnerability, and that forces us into a state where we must focus on helping each other survive instead of what we're really here to do, which is working to dismantle the systems that oppress us in the first place. And unfortunately, that's the point. Like, we have to ask ourselves and each other, why do migrant workers have to keep working 24/7 without pay, enduring abuse, surviving war zones? Why are we in these situations in the first place? Why are governments who are systematically unable to protect their citizens abroad allowed to keep sending women into a system everyone knows is abusive? And how come nobody has ever been held accountable for these decades-long crises that has impacted migrant workers in the region for generations? There's a lot more to unpack here, but I'll end with this. The current system works perfectly well for those who benefit from our labor and from our exploitation. They love to talk about our resilience because it costs nothing to continue with the patriarchal neoliberal nonsense that has been destroying Black migrant lives in the region for decades. And real change, the kind that would actually protect migrant workers, that costs something. It requires people to give up power and to build new systems. Anything else is just maintaining crisis as a permanent condition.
Many thanks, Francisca, for such a powerful start. It's super important to call out governments on their inaction and the perpetuation of violence that they create, and what that means then for Black feminist organizations who have to create crisis response year after year after year. I see that loads of people are relating to what you're saying and approving your message in the chat. So thank you, everyone. And please continue to share your messages and experiences in the chat. We see that there are so many similar situations in different countries of Africa and beyond. So it's also important to make these connections and talk about that. I am now going to pass the mic to Chandris.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. It's afternoon in Colombia already. I'm currently in Bogota, which is the capital of Colombia. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I would say I really relate to what our friend Francisca was sharing because Black women in Colombia, I would say, as a general way, Black women will go through similar crises. In the case of Colombia, we're facing this in our country. And that's why I would say in Colombia and in a general way in Latin America, it's imperative to take a look at the impact of crisis with an intersectional look, understanding intersectionality as a group of characteristics that we all live through, the ones we experience as Black women, and that somehow are a system of oppression, and they are not as isolated. They are a combination of these different characteristics. And this is an important analysis for us Black women because it let us understand the multiple dimensions of the oppressions we're facing. And it implies to recognize that the experience of violence and discrimination are not the same. They vary depending on the vast diversity of life experience that we all have, such as social identities, gender, class, territoriality, ethnicity, and it's those are the things that help us kind of make differences between us among us in our country. And something that is really making our crisis worse is the hypersexualization of our bodies here in Colombia. This happens for the whole Black community, it's the same for women and men, Black men and women here in Colombia. And we women or and Black women's bodies are receiving this in a harder way. There is exoticization and there is a hypersexualization of our bodies and our life experiences, and that is something that we can face in the different spaces that we occupy. I would say somehow this leads us to empowering ourselves, just understanding how empowerment is totally subjective, but it's understanding these type of realities ourselves. I think that's the main thing, because when we talk about the different ethnic groups in the country, there are some groups that do not recognize themselves as Black, and understanding how racialized people and people who are not racialized, how this allows us to create ways in which we can soften the multiple crises that we face. Taking this into account, um, our country is a very, I would say, complex case because there are not different scenarios for recognizing, I would say, the Colombian space or the Colombian agenda really lacks scenarios for recognizing racism. You know, it's not really something people would recognize here, how Black people face or deals with racism. It's kind of a myth because the white community would say, like, okay, I don't go through this, so they think it's a myth. But it is our reality. We face this every day, and especially Black women go through this on a higher level. I would say there is no really a way of like doing this exercise on a daily basis. So it's something that keeps us on alert, constantly on alert, and that leads to a constant struggle in order to help see that this happens. Because if we don't recognize there is racism, it will just continue with all of the crises that we face in our country. That also leads to it also leads to get a wrong conception of harmony, you know, and how harmony really works. And it's like it will happen. It's important that we really call things by its name. That's the reason why there are some new Black organizations, and the previous organizations that we had have empowered themselves or have been strengthening their struggles through this recognition. And there is this, I think the practice we're working with is marionette, is helping us strengthen our struggles in the many different scenarios that we are working with. But this is taking a look at the preservation of culture and the environment, taking into account that Colombia is facing very harsh, very problematic violence contexts, starting with the armed conflict that has been in our country for over 70 years and that has impacted especially Black populations, Black communities, and specifically Black women who have been affected the most by this armed conflict. I would say that this concept of marionage, we call cimarronaje, has allowed to has allowed to strengthen some of the struggles of Black women, helping us put in our perspective on how feminisms should be understood and how the Black feminism should be also understood. And I think one of the things that we can all see is that for the first time we have a Black vice president in our country, and she's been able to accept some of those bases, and that has helped some of the previous organizations strengthen and the creation of new Black organizations as well. And it's helping us face our crisis in a better way. I think we have been through all the type of crisis you can go through, and it feels in a very harsh way, but I think it's also help our times, and specifically Black women, to have the opportunity to participate in these powers of spaces of power. And I believe that this really makes a difference in all of us.
Very much for talking about the situation in Colombia. Before I give floor to Pascal, I'd just like to say that if you have any questions, there is a chat, a box where you can ask your questions, or the question and answer, a box where you can download your questions. At the end of the webinar, we shall take a number of those questions and answer them. We shall take the time to talk to each other in question and answer. I'd like to remind you that don't have too much time. I think time is our biggest enemy. I'd like to ask you to be very precise and not perhaps talk more than 4 to 5 minutes, so that you have time to listen to everyone and then to be able to address a number of questions. So I'm going to give the floor to Pascal for her definition of what a crisis is. Thank you very much. So good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? I come from a country in which the issue of instability, the issue of chaos is something that we have known for decades or even more. It is a country which has also gone through through a lot of resistance, at the biggest resistance movement, whether these were national movements which took place in Haiti and which were beneficial for the rest of the world, and especially beneficial to other countries that are Black, like Haiti. But it is also a country which I think also has has also managed to have quite a bit of freedom for the black for the populations of black people, but Haiti has had to pay a very high price for that, a price which we now have to pay today. So we have gone through so much instability, through so much chaos, with really few moments of peace. And the idea of a crisis is often banalized. It is interpreted in a given yeah, and people forget that different groups of people understand it differently. And this is what we are going through in Haiti today. There is a way of interpreting what a crisis is and understanding what is happening, the different communities, and especially the most vulnerable, the most discriminated against, understand the crisis differently. For example, in crisis, when we talk about a political crisis, as you know, today, we have not had elections. And so when we talk about a political crisis, it means that there has been no elections, but the crisis was there long before there not being elections. There was a political crisis, a political crisis that um, we which which is not understood by the different groups so there's a lot of violence, and there has been a lot of abuse of human rights. So, so we have to say, when we have sometimes people say they're elections, but we are able to impose whatever leaders we wanted to impose as so. Then, if as long as the elections, then there's no crisis. Then people say there's no security crisis, but there is a group that so when there's a community that is not impacted by the armed conflict or the armed conflict, then people think that there is no security crisis. I'm going to try and go a bit slower. And so I was going to say that there is no security crisis. So the security crisis that you're confronted with today, um, in the international newspapers and the international media. That is where we learn. But that is not the perspective of of the vulnerable people who are in their little in the little areas where they live. But because that's how they have been living, they have been victims of these armed gangs. And so the majority of the people, even the poor, do not have access to the most basic survival needs. But there is an economic crisis. It is that the people who we are feeling that there is an impact on the population, which is the majority population, because most of the population is poor, and today we have the poor are over 52% of women, and in Haiti, the women are the poorest group. But that does not mean that there has been an increase of the crisis. But in the last few years in Haiti, maybe we can go to we can go to 2018 with the arrival in power of a political regime which was able to which really brought the crisis to exponential levels and to levels that we had never known before that. But today, we're talking about more than 3 million people who have been assassinated from January 2000. Before January, we have 4,000 prisoners in the streets because one of the biggest prisons in the country was destroyed. Everybody escaped and nothing was done. Now today, the Port-au-Prince has been taken over by gangs, and as someone said at the very beginning, at the beginning of 2024, there was no air travel, and several companies even today are no longer flying in and out of Haiti because nobody was able to manage to control the transport from the international airport that we know. And so because of the gangs, and as I said, this is the next year, it will be 10 years that we shall not have had any elections in that country. And so all of the political institutions are not working, and the economic situation also is very sad. We could continue to talk about it to say there is a kind of increase in the deepening of the crisis, but at the same time, the crisis is lived, and it can be translated by most of the people, but the people, the majority of the people. So the question is that do the people know, do they have individual or collective well-being? We can say no. And at which point can we say that a group, when as long as a group of people are living well, we don't talk about a crisis. When you're talking about vulnerable people who are discriminated against, impacted, those people, they do not talk, even when they don't have a good level of living, and they don't talk about a crisis. But we as feminists, as Black feminists, our role is to actually bring back to the table, just to say that it is not, you cannot deny the crisis just because a few people are not being impacted, and that it is our duty to actually highlight aspects of the crisis that are completely forgotten, and we need to amplify those elements, and we need to talk about that crisis. It is also not the understanding of the international community. That is not the understanding that we should have of our crisis as a Black population, or even as a marginalized population. So what is our own definition of the crisis? How do we experience it on a day-to-day basis? And what are the most important aspects that we want to get involved as a Black feminist and as a Haitian feminist, because we know that, that it is not these are not necessarily the priorities with the major international and not the ones who define. There has been a political interference since independence by countries such as France and the United States and other countries, and which imposed their own agenda, so that we can see that they didn't worry about the well-being of the people. What are the political, the economic measures today? The international community has imposed a constitutional reform project on Haiti. It is terrible, just to say that a constitution for a country is actually imposed by the International Committee, and we as a people have been excluded in the process because they have their own agenda, their stakes, their economic, but we do not take into account the people of Haiti. And but all this is done by people who are very far from Haiti. They don't know what is happening in Haiti. So for us, how we should not forget uh, uh, aspects that have been deliberately forgotten, the issue of migration, of violence, the problems of the people as a Black feminist. It is our role to bring these subjects back into the discussion, put them back on the table, bring them back on the agenda, and ensure that they are talked about. So so, so we need to organize ourselves so that we can have discussions. We are blocked, and you know that there are a number of mechanisms that have been put in place to keep us from interfering with the agendas that have been imposed on us. And there is a crisis that is not our crisis, our understanding of the crisis. And as I said from the beginning, in spite of the facts that I talked about and are presented by the international media, it is very important to look at these aspects that lived, that are the reality of the most vulnerable community in our country, and women are the most among the poorest of the poor. And so it is very, very important. And I think that we need to give our own definition, our own understanding of what we call a crisis, so that we can then make our own contribution, a contribution that would help us, because on a day-to-day basis, we are the victims of the crisis.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Pascal. So I'm now going to hand over to Sarah for the definition of crisis. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Sarah Muawiyah from Sudan. I'm very happy for choosing this word polycrisis.
The Sudanese actually context is very complicated, and it's very diverse. But this, unfortunately, since the independence, we were not able to celebrate this diversity, and we have embraced actually exclusion and discrimination and marginalization. And we believe as Sudanese feminists that those polycrises are not only intersectional, they are aggravating and they are reproducing themselves, just like the situation in the Sudanese context, with the example of the intersectionality between climate change and racism. And actually, racism in Sudan has reached very bad situation. It has reached ethnic cleansing, and this ethnic cleansing actually is facing a number of ethnic groups in Sudan during this current war, and it has been faced by the Masalit group who are living in Darfur. They have been forced, deported and forced to leave their homes, to go on foot to the neighboring Chad. More than 100,000 persons have been forced to flee their homes, and they have faced a lot of atrocities. Climate change has led to a decline in vegetation in the western part of the country, and this has affected the lives of different ethnic groups that are engaged in agriculture or pastoralism. And because of the absence of the state and its exclusion in regulating land ownership relations, in addition to the centralized grip, this has led to the aggravation of the situation and the reproduction of a different crisis. And this has prompted the people to return to ethnic and tribal groups to defend their rights. They turned up to take up arms, and this has led to the creation of a number of armies that are now fighting in Sudan. and this is not the first conflict in modern history of Sudan after independence. Sudanese men and women lived through the longest civil war in Africa, which began in 1983 and ended in 2005. I'm currently living with my family in Cairo, where I fled last year for safety due to the outbreak of the war. But this war has redefined what it means to be a Black feminist in Sudan. I discovered or realized that I need my Black feminists after the war because of what I've discovered about the reality of solidarity relations in other contexts, or let us say in the Arab context specifically. Sudan's second civil war began in 1983 and lasted until 2005, only 11 years after the first civil war, which began before Sudan's independence in 1955 and lasted until 1972, and was mostly fought in the southern parts of Sudan. The division of the country into northern and southern parts is a colonial division, and it was one of the longest and most violent civil wars in Africa and the world. The second civil war killed 1.9 million civilians and displaced 4 million, while the current war has displaced 12 million Sudanese men and women. The death toll has reached 150,000 civilians. And I take this opportunity to commemorate the lives of the martyrs who died in the ongoing massacres in Jazeera State, which began in December, and also the 26 women who committed suicide out of fear of rape, which is used as a weapon and as one of the forms of gender-based violence practiced since the beginning of this war. I salute Sudanese women for their extraordinary resilience during this war, even though as Black women they are expected to play superhuman roles. I work in the non-feminist movement, which focuses on advocacy activities, and we try to provide through analysis and understanding our own narrative of current events through the lens of feminist political economy, and in our efforts to survive and push for support efforts in this war. We are dealing with the lack of solidarity, especially from the Arab community. Sudanese society in northern Sudan, after the secession of South Sudan in 2011, we became two countries. This Sudanese society is experiencing an identity crisis between Arab and African identity. At the beginning of the year, after organizing efforts to evacuate those trapped in conflict zones, communications were cut off in almost half of Sudan, and only about half of Sudan is covered by electricity service, indicating an unbalanced development crisis since independence. We discovered during this crisis, even after the communications were restored, that there were no donations to support the evacuation or the food, medicine, or sanitary napkins for women, except by the Sudanese men and women themselves. Even though we identify ourselves as part of the Arab community whose language we speak, we had to deal with the limited resources in addition to other problems and debts that we inherited from the dictatorships that we overthrew through popular revolutions. All of these debts were borrowed through military dictatorships that the international community didn't mind lending to, leaving us to pay the interest. While working to raise funds and highlights the abuses in Sudan, we discovered that there were obstacles to our relationship with the international community, such as the need to have bank accounts. Sudan, before the popular December Revolution that saw widespread female participation in 2019, suffered from being classified as a state sponsor of terrorism through the previous regime that ruled Sudan for 30 years due to its hosting of terrorists, as well as being accused of being a path to access funding for Palestinian armed resistance movements. This has led to the imposition of 30 years of sanctions and economic blockade. After the revolution, Sudan was removed from the sanctions list, but major financial institutions were not enthusiastic about Sudan returning to the global banking system. Now, in the midst of the war, a large number of international financial institutions have stopped our financial transactions, which hinders efforts to provide support and response, in addition to the physical obstacles faced by the Sudanese activists to participate in advocacy activities, for example. And this is where the so-called feminist war reviews came in, which alerted us to the terms of solidarity that we had received or that we expected. As Sudanese activists, we have participated in a number of events, the most important of which we remember in the last 5 years, the Army General Command Quarters sit-in, where we organized a parade to reject Sudan's involvement in the aggression against Yemen. We revoked the participation of the Sudanese army, sending soldiers or selling soldiers to participate in that war waged against Yemen by some of the Gulf countries. But we discovered the dynamics of solidarity and the complexity of the issues relating to color and race. Some of those countries that we are following and in solidarity with, what happens in there, don't actually know a thing about Sudan. We discovered that we know too much about the places, neighborhoods in Palestine and cities and what's happening in South Lebanon, but we don't know a thing about Chad, which is the largest host of Sudanese refugees, and we don't know a thing about the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is neighboring us.
Sorry, but we need to move on. We will get back to you for the rest of the questions. I do apologize. I know we can discuss about this for hours because these are very important topics, but I want to give the floor to Nadia and we'll come back to you later. Thank you very much for your intervention. And I believe we do agree on the fact that there is a big invisibilization of the situation in Sudan. Also, to allow interpretation, please, all panelists are invited to speak slowly because it's not easy to interpret for everyone and in the various languages. So this is a gentle reminder, please slow down. I'm now going to give the floor to Nadia Aidio, who is our advisor, principal advisor for philanthropy. Nadia is an African feminist, expert in feminist philanthropy, passionate about social justice and gender inclusion. Nadia is also the author on the book on Black perspectives on crisis and polycrises. Please watch out for this publication. A question for you now regarding financing, because the tragical thing is the fact that money is key to many of our struggles. So one question regarding donors. According to you, how are donors addressing crisis and what needs to change, in your opinion, to allow those donors to support Black feminist movements in crisis?
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, everyone. I mean, I think I'll start by saying that, there's the theory of what funders say that they believe and they hear from their movement partners, and there's the actual practice of the things that are done while other things are being said. What you heard today from most of our speakers is that, Black feminists really expand how we think about crises and the temporality of crises. There isn't a beginning or an end, right? And funders love to come in at what we call a crisis inflection point, where it's like, oh, there's a fire here. Come on, here are buckets of water. Put out the water, Black feminists. And then, okay, that's done. All right, peace, see you, right? And I think that what's clear here is that, Black feminist responses don't care about these timelines, these, absurd timelines, I would say, but are more attentive to how consistently we interact with each other, we connect with each other, and we build worlds where these crises are not cyclical. Where we, can you hear me? Where we,
Oui, parfaitement.
yeah, okay. All right. So I think where we understand that the rush to push people towards fighting fires takes us away from building Black feminist worlds, right? Takes us away from fighting the oppressions. And I think this is the place where funders are deeply uncomfortable because they just want to slap a band-aid on the problem and say, oh, look, we have one that has Wakanda Forever on it. Put it on your wound and please go away and come back when it's bleeding again. We'll swap it for another one. When you look at the numbers, you'll see that for every dollar that went to disasters, only about 10 cents went to resilience, risk reduction, preparedness, reconstruction, and recovery, right? And then when you start talking about Palestinian liberation, giving indigenous people their land back, supporting sex workers, reparations. And it's like, woo, let's first put out the fires. We'll worry about these things later. While at the same time acknowledging that these things are the cause, right? These are the things that you should do so that you don't have the crisis. So I think one thing that's important for funders to do is to center Black feminist knowledge, voices, perspectives in the response, and center this idea of the communities of solidarity, protection, and care, and address this thing of constantly putting people in firefighting mode so that you are nurturing a crisis of imagination. Because if you don't have the space to imagine and to dream Black feminist worlds, then you are in a way contributing to perpetuating these oppressions that make philanthropy feel useful about itself, right? And so I think if we're really serious about funding through this lens, then we need to change how we resource through this lens. One thing is, number one, to acknowledge that philanthropy are not the saviors of the world. Funding will not bring an end to crises, but what funders can do is resource the movements that will, and in ways that are aligned, targeted, and intentional. Because if you want to change the tides of crisis and make actual differences in the lives of those who are most impacted, then you have to be intentional about it. What does intentionality mean? It means, number one, having that intersectional lens, obviously, but it's also about funding collective preparedness, funding Black feminist community protection initiatives. They are there, they exist, right? And also not funding responses in the aftermath of an inflection point because, oh, it's on the news, right? Because you want people to have the structures in place to repair and prevent in the long term. And philanthropy is part of the problem. Because if you are throwing all the money in the firefighting and saying, oh, look, we have given, I don't know how many $120 billion went to Ukraine. You know how much was promised to Sudan? 2 billion, right? And so if you're saying this and doing this, then you are part of the problem. And so what are some of the things I think is to, number one, acknowledge that there's a myth that goes around in philanthropy, oh, but it's so hard to fund in times of crisis. There are no banks, there's violence, there's no internet. So how are feminist funds doing it, right? So I think the one thing is to acknowledge that you can't fund in times of crisis if you really want to, and you can't fund community proximate organizations if you want to, because if you are grounding your resources in compassionate, responsive, and agile approaches, then you can do it. And I think there's also a thing about improving contractual relationships. Why would you have a contract with a partner for over 10 years and then suddenly they're in a crisis and it's like, oh, hello, we need your bank statements and your financial report before we can send you money. What has been going on in the last 10 years, right? Or saying to a partner, oh, you can only use 10% of your budget to address the fact that your office was blown up and you have to move. Oh, you're from Darfur, but you're in Chad. I'm sorry, we only fund in Sudan. We can't fund you in Central Africa. So I think that we really need to think about how we even think about people in crises and what kind of resourcing we want to bring. The other thing is that there are regions, as we mentioned earlier, that are invisibilized deliberately, right? If you are from the Caribbean, if you are from Central Africa, if you're from the Greater Horn of Africa, if you're from the Sahel, there is a sort of normalization or fetishization of your suffering. Oh, it's normal, so, we'll keep putting the Band-Aid and you'll figure it out, right? And I think that funders need to start investing in accountability, leadership, and ownership, and funding relationship skills and strategies, as opposed to funding fighting fires. And who are even fighting the fires, first of all, is the other question. The other thing I'll say is that there are things that funders need to do and think differently about in terms of how much money you commit. Because it's one thing to say that we want to resolve crises, we want to center Black feminist leaders and Black feminist movements, and then you give them $1 million and you say, oh, we'll give 500 million to I don't know, the UN system. And we've all seen what the UN system is doing in Haiti, right? For example. And then we'll give Haitian feminists, I don't know, $10,000. They'll figure it out. So I think that there has to be a deep accountability that comes with philanthropy in acknowledging all the things that it is doing in perpetuating harm during times of crisis, and instead flipping that around. So I think I will stop here, and I'll just say that I want you to read the brief. There's a lot more in there, but I'll just say that there are many ways in which funders need to show up differently and properly, and I think that starts from a lens of self-awareness and actual accountability and intentionality in centering and funding Black feminist movements.
Hey, Nadia, a punchline queen. Thank you so much. I saw a lot of heart and clapping emojis popping up. I also see that there's a lot of people agreeing with you and your statement. So thank you so much for that. So, as always, or like often, we are lacking time because there's so much passion and warmth around the conversations that we curate. So what we're going to do is move on to one of the questions that we received in the chat.
In these days when we're pulled from side to side in different directions, and in these times when there's so many crises, how can we maintain and sustain our solidarity? What can we do better? I think this is a very, very important question. Now, what you're going to do, I'm going to give the floor in the reverse order in which I give the floor. We're going to give the floor to Sarah, and then unfortunately I did interrupt you, Sarah, because what you're saying was very important as concerns this issue of solidarity, but we have a very little time left, so I really plead with you to remain very concise. I know it is difficult, but please let's answer in a maximum of 3 minutes. It would be wonderful. Otherwise I'll have to interrupt you, which I don't like to do. So I'm going to give the floor to Sarah.
Really speak fast, and if you let me speak at my normal speed, 3 minutes would be more than enough. I'm going to talk about the topic of effective crisis response and how it can be seen from a Black feminist perspective. I would like to answer this question from both the response from two sides, the response of the international community and our own response as Sudanese people. We need to provide a better understanding of the nature of crisis in Sudan by using the lens of feminist political economy to study and analyze to understand the situation and society and its reaction with the political, cultural, and social aspects and their interaction with other contexts. And we believe that we understand the Sudanese situation best. We look at the distribution and access to wealth and power, about the decisions, why and by whom and through whom those decisions is made, and how these decisions are affecting us as a matter of structure and effectiveness and distribution from a sensitive point of view as Black feminist activists. Because we cannot look at the crisis as if society is made up of a homogeneous and similar unit that has the same potentials and needs and problems and the ability to access wealth and power. It differs from one place to another, taking into account the environmental sustainability and access to natural resources, because one of the challenges is the lack of thoughtful, sensitive analysis, as well as the need to build coalitions of interest among Black women in the global South. One of the challenges we are facing right now in Sudan is the sale of Sudanese land, especially the sale of ports on the Red Sea as part of the the efforts of the Emirati and Gulf countries to swallow up to 12 African ports. And obviously, resisting something similar across 12 countries would be far more effective than resisting each country resisting this as individual countries, which would cause a waste of expertise, a waste of knowledge and opportunities for success through cooperation and through networks of alliances and networks of interest. As for the international community, I find its response politically and economically inappropriate. At the humanitarian conference in Cairo last year, the financial response was estimated to the Sudanese crisis was estimated at 5% of our needs, and this is a shameful deficit. What needs to change is that the international community stops trying to pressure Black women to shape their response and shape the Sudanese feminist movements according to the vision and discourse of the international organizations, instead of providing flexible and diverse support to create a grassroots and rooted movement to confront the main enemy of Sudanese women, which is the military patriarchy. The international community has chosen to provide support in a superficial and selective and targeted way, such as workshops, awareness raising activities, and capacity building activities, according to a quasi-identical agenda in situations of war and peace, and that's not tailored or situational, not taking into consideration the war ongoing in Sudan. It also supports individualistic tendencies that ignore the framework of feminist analysis that enables us to understand and develop our reality. And I'm not just talking about financial support. The Sudanese women activists deserve financial support and political cover, and not to be left to face regional and global complicity, because they have already paid the price of belonging to the international community through decades of sanctions and blockades. And it's time to show them the political and economical solidarity they deserve.
Thank you
Pascal,
very much, Sarah. You can answer the same question, Pascal. I think we need to have confidence because we don't all experience the crisis in different ways. We needed to, and we need to understand how the different groups experience the crisis that they are going through. I think it's also important to understand that the crisis is lived in different ways. I cannot close my eyes at what is happening somewhere else and thinking that when when I resolve the problem in my home, in my house, and that the solutions that could change things for me, whether they're good for me or not for women or the women, the Black women elsewhere in the world. So I think it is very important to consider all the different crises. For example, we're looking at the crisis in Sudan and Haiti. We can't close our eyes, and so we cannot think just about looking for solutions to our own crisis alone. And so there's also the crisis in what we have experienced with Ukraine that shows that the realities that we live in are interconnected, and how the economic problems, for example, when the Black people that can have an impact on Black populations, Black women populations elsewhere. So what is happening in Haiti can have an impact elsewhere. So our crisis is to actually to begin to understand what is happening in other countries, even though things are happening in a different way. So for example, what is when we talk about capitalism and the mechanisms of domination, how which are being used in our country, but we experience that differently. But we need to work together across the world so that we can actually come up with sustainable solutions, so that whenever we experience as Black women, as Black feminists, I also think that this idea of redefining the question as to how we're going to support ourselves, how we access resources, how we can come up with our own agenda, and how the other Black feminists and the women, even with the other, or everybody can understand exactly what it is that we as Black Haitians are what we are learning. But we learn from the solutions that are shared by women, Black women from other parts of the world, other realities. So today I'm not living in my country because, but when I came here to the United Nations, the first house where I lived was paid for by Black feminists here in the United States. And so what can we then do together? And I am sure that the solidarity uh, is these are women that had never met in my life and so on and so forth. But when I arrived here, the very first days in this country, it is the solidarity of Black feminists that made it possible for me to survive for several months before I could begin to do my work here for my country. But now to give the possibility of o- be able to get the kind of a security that I needed so that I can continue to work for those women who are trapped in Haiti. For me, it is a way of ensuring that solidarity, even when I am outside of my country, that the circumstances in which you try to work, we can the feminists from Haiti meet feminists from the Dominican Republic, and the two countries are very different. But when they get together, when they live in the same city, they get together. They talk about the different crises in the different countries, the issue of violence, the economic crisis, among other crises. This is the question of peace and solidarity that makes it possible for us to be able to make progress today, even though our people may be trapped in Haiti. We cannot be able to get out of the crisis because as Haitians, we it's difficult for us to interact with people who speak English. It's difficult for us to benefit from a number of things. But today, as a Black group, we see the Kenyans, for example, are part of the international force. And we are trying to see how women from other countries can work with us because we have lived with the UN forces in Haiti. So we want to see how there can be feminists. We can collaborate with feminists in Kenya so that from a political point of view, we can actually begin to collaborate. So that's how it can work. It can be done in different ways. Thank you very much for this contribution. Several things. We're coming towards the end of our webinar. I'm going to ask you to be patient, please, and to be a bit late in our finishing. And before I give the floor to Chandrisa for the final and very short responses to the issue of solidarity, we're going to ask a question which is
We are
very
going
important.
to add a question which is very important and which came out of the Q&A session.
And the question is around people living with disabilities. So how do women and girls in your respective countries are coping with situations of crisis? So beside the question of solidarity, that would be an extra question to answer. And please keep it short. Thank you so much.
Okay, so regarding solidarity, in any other way, I identify myself with what other partners have said, and it's that the ideal way of doing solidarity and to get together and share like we're doing right now, that's very significant, very important, and that will surely be replicated in other spaces in which we can strengthen our unions and strengthen our fights as a movement. So being in these spaces and share and they construct ourselves and construct ourselves is a part of the process of being able to build and to progress, to move forward towards new ways of uh, flowing in spaces for one objective regarding that. And concerning the situation of different capacities or disabilities that touch our children and kids and teenagers in our country, there are a lot of limitations, important limitations, and mostly to girls and teenagers and boys with different capacities who are Black, because infrastructure is not the best. We don't really have much access for them in our spaces. Moreover, in our communities that are impoverished and marginalized, and conditions get more complex, even more complex, because there are a lot of problems like state neglect, a lot of violence in our territories. So that hinders actual access for our differently able kids and teenagers. There's their development, their optimal life development, but still, this is something we've been working on, and that's something we've been trying to fix through different advocacy processes regarding gender and other like uh, um, issues, but it's not really easy in the midst of so much neglect that is lived as cruelty for us. If we take into account that we are girls and women that have been abandoned in that different conditions go across our lives, and that hinders even more optimal development for our kids. But we've been working on it. We've been doing that work to change realities.
Thanks a lot, Jandris. Now passing the mic to Francisca.
Yeah, so regarding this question, right now in Lebanon, like who's doing the real work of actually helping displaced migrants? It's not the Lebanese government that's barely able to care for its displaced citizens. It's not our embassies or our consulates who don't have the resources or are simply unwilling to assist their citizens. And it's not big international organizations and UN agencies. It's the migrant-led community groups, organizations run by migrant women themselves, working with absolutely minimal resources. Like these are the women who are facing the exact same dangers as the people they're trying to help. They're navigating the same risks of sexual violence, displacement, dealing with the same racial discrimination, worried about the same safety issues. And they're doing everything in their power to rescue other abandoned migrants in dangerous areas, even though their own freedom of movement is also restricted, and they're still showing up to do the work. So based on our experience at Enya working through multiple compounding crises, solidarity isn't about dropping in with temporary relief and then bouncing when the headlines fade. It's about building and sustaining networks of protection and networks of care that are led by the communities that are most impacted. And the reason why we are able to reach displaced migrants where they are today is because we've been through so much. The Beirut port explosion in 2020, economic collapse, COVID, and all of this has pushed us closer together, all of us, migrants, asylum seekers, refugees, domestic workers, and their descendants. So we've invested a lot in our community and empowering organizers and sharing our resources with community groups who do impactful work. And we also have to understand that the crisis is not confined to a certain geography. And solidarity shouldn't be either. It isn't just a Lebanese problem or an Ethiopian problem. It's part of a global system of racialized, gendered exploitation. The same oppressive forces that push women out of Ethiopia, these are also connected to the systems that trap migrant workers under kafala in Lebanon and across the Middle East. And it leaves them unprotected during war and makes it nearly impossible for us to build sustainable lives when we return home. So we need responses that match the international scale of the problem. And this is why we need to keep pushing for international solidarity, because we know that the crises facing migrant workers in Lebanon today could, unfortunately, be facing migrant workers elsewhere in the region tomorrow. So we must think beyond what is within our capacity to handle emergencies better. It's more about addressing the disease rather than the visible symptoms of crisis. And we can only do that when we're equipped with the resources to protect and care for our communities. And in practice, it means embedding ourselves in our communities, building networks of solidarity locally and across borders, regionally, globally, sharing strategies, resources, and support across all of these networks. And also, we want to like addressing the immediate emergency is a priority, but it's not a goal. Our work is about justice on the longer term, supporting migrants who've survived kafala and defending our right to live a dignified life. It's about accountability too. It's a real shame that we have to remind and advocate duty bearers to do the work that they're supposed to do. But we will continue to do that and insist on it because it's such an unfair burden to be placed on the shoulders of people who have so little access to resources and like have to beg for scraps simply to survive. So we must use these moments to build stronger networks of solidarity beyond our specific movements and work towards transforming the systems that create crisis in the first place.
Thank you very much, Francisca, for these closing words, which are very strong words, which remind us that more than ever before, we need everyone else. More than ever before, solidarity is extremely important because we cannot look up to those people who are paid, who are mandated to do this work, unfortunately. And it was really wonderful to have had you all talk about what is happening in Colombia, in Haiti, in Sudan, in Ethiopia, in Lebanon. I'd like to say a very big thank you to our 4 panelists. Thank you to the interpreters who did an exceptional task yet once again this evening. We'd like to thank you as well. Thank you to all of the participants who stayed longer than we had planned. We apologize for the delay, but we are all in agreement. It was much more complicated to put together a conversation that could have continued for 3 hours. I'm going to give the floor to my colleague Nadia so that she can conclude the session. Thank you very much.
I mean, how do I conclude after all of this fire? What I'll say is that one thing that's really clear and that came to us as well as we were working with different partners through this brief was that Black feminists really ask the real questions, right? They'll ask if the community is safe, if we have space for growth and accountability. Are we contributing to the systems that can harm us or show us care? So when we are thinking about building Black feminist worlds in times of polycrisis, we're thinking about care and protection, radical love for each other, and addressing root causes, right? And so I think that's where I want us to leave each other today, to continue to extend this radical love and solidarity for each other and our movements, because that's what we need at this time. I'll encourage everybody to read the brief. We will share it with you, of course, via email, and also we'll make sure it's available on our website for you in the coming weeks. This is not the end of the Black Feminist in Politics, for the Black Feminist Politics series. We'll be back in 2025, so please stay signed up for more conversations of this kind. And I wish you all well. Have a lovely rest of your week and see you soon. Take good care of yourselves. Thank you. Bye.
The birds are in the trees. They're singing me a melody.